right, shall I start?
I'll leave it with you, Anthony.
Okay, so I'll start. So I wanted to focus my presentation today on human rights with respect to oppressed populations across the globe, and in particular for me anyway, touch on UNHCR and its action or its relative inaction towards these different groups. And I've invited, in my opinion, quite an extraordinary panel of human rights defenders. I've got Dr. Thoreau Redcrow, who is a global conflict analyst. I've got Miss Angela Fredericks, and I think most of you will know her from the Home to Willa campaign in Australia, and Maha Ramakrishna, who is a human rights lawyer from Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. Now, these guys really are the heavyweights of international and sort of domestic human rights, and it's an absolute privilege for me to have them and presenting at my beloved workplace. So I'll say a little spiel about each of them before they speak, and they'll have 10 minutes to speak, and then you'll hear a bell ding like that, and then you'll have about 60 seconds to wrap up. So a few words first about the recent UNHCR session. So the 49th session of UNHCR in March this year was heavily dominated by what's been happening in the Ukraine, and it's been receiving 24-hour mainstream media coverage. Now, the world's been able to see 24/7 images, especially from the Ukrainian town of Bucha after the withdrawal of Russian troops, showing the bodies of civilians who appear to have been executed and left in the streets or buried in mass graves, and the world has been able to be appropriately appalled. Now, these are from photojournalist Carol Guzzi on the 19th of the 4th, 2022, after Russia had exited Bucha. Now, I'm putting these up here because it's not the usual case where you get mainstream media access, including tabloid journalists, into a war crime scene, and that's within days. This same weekend, Israel dropped consecutive bombs on the Gaza Strip, and that was without a skerrit of any mainstream media attention. So I'd like to go through what was the sequence of events in the Ukraine. So within 5 days of Russia dropping the first bombs on Kyiv in the Ukraine, with the first missiles fired on the 24th of February this year, Russia has been referred to the International Criminal Court by 38 countries across Europe, and this is largely led by the United Kingdom. On the 3rd of March 2022, the International Criminal Court launches a boots-on-ground investigation for war crimes against Russia in the Ukraine. Putin is accused of specifically targeting civilian areas, and as we can see in the photos, also healthcare facilities. This is an initiative led mostly by the United Kingdom, Boris Johnson stating, and I quote, "Tonight, 38 countries from across the world have made the largest ever referral to the International Criminal Court for Russia's barbaric invasion of the Ukraine. Germany, France, Spain, and Italy have all backed the ICC referral, with Canada, Australia, and New Zealand amongst the non-EU states to give their support, and of course, America." So the death toll to date currently stands at 2,729 civilians, and that's according to UNHCR investigators, and 173 of them being children, with a further 2,900 non-fatal casualties, and with obviously no hospitals to take them to, and 5 million Ukrainian stateless refugees who have fled across Europe. And this is the largest exodus of refugees Europe's seen since World War II. So on the 7th of April, in a very US-led resolution, Russia is suspended from the United Nations Human Rights Council, meaning Russia will no longer be a signatory to the European Convention on Human Rights, and more concerningly, its citizens will no longer be able to file applications to the European Court of Human Rights, also meaning Russia is no longer able to speak at UNHCR, but they may still attend. Now, the calls for this suspension was largely initiated and spearheaded by the United States, and there was a vote amongst the UNHCR member nations with the majority favouring the suspension. Heavily US-initiated resolution has now been adopted by the 193-member General Assembly and expressed, and I quote, "grave concerns at the ongoing breach of human rights and the humanitarian crisis in the Ukraine." Okay. So the Russian Foreign Ministry sort of vehemently rejected the suspension, calling the move illegal and politically motivated, aimed at ostentatiously punishing a sovereign UN member state that pursues an independent domestic and foreign policy. But the US Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, has hailed UNHCR's vote, stating, quote, "A country that is perpetrating gross and systematic violations of human rights should not sit on a body whose job it is to protect those rights. We in the United States uphold and protect the human rights of the world's vulnerable nations." I think the video. Now, this is not a, if you just pause it for a second. This is not a footage of the Ukraine. This is a snippet from Michael Moore's incredible documentary, Bowling for Columbine, released about 12 months after the Twin Towers disaster in 2002. Okay. Thanks.
We don't have audio on our end, but I'm familiar with the clip you're playing, so I already know what he's saying, but I don't know if Angela needs audio. What's happening? Next one. Well, let me go. Okay, thanks.
So 2009, Sri Lankan President Mahinda Rajapaksa orders the execution of 140,000 plus Tamil civilians by the Sri Lankan army in a state-enforced no-fire zone in the northeastern strip of Sri Lankan coastline. Civilians are trapped between the ground and overhead shelling and the ocean. Extrajudicial execution of surrendered prisoners of war. Again, these are war crimes. This is live footage taken quite brazenly by the perpetrators, circulated and then shown to UNHCR, which first then go through the process of validating their authenticity and are yet to push any independent and non-domestic investigations. So the question is why? Arms and LTT coordinates provided to the Sri Lankan army from Israel and the United States. Mahinda Rajapaksa, that's on the left, charged with war crimes from the UNHCR 2009, but still no sanctions. Rajapaksa recently wins the March 2022 elections as Prime Minister alongside brother President Gotabaya Rajapaksa. The Rajapaksas have escaped liability for war crimes for the past 14 years by most of the planet, including UNHCR and Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka still attends UNHCR sessions. So UNHCR, as we can see, with the Ukraine, is completely capable of swift and decisive action with the United States and Europe prompting it. But why is it dragging its feet for decades for any form of retribution and reconciliation for Tamils in Rajapaksa, Sri Lanka? And I realise I've sort of heavily underplayed the depth of the inactivity by the UNHCR in pushing for international intervention for war crimes, either by referral to the International Criminal Court or trade sanctions like the withdrawal of the EU GSP Plus facility, which it did impose on Sri Lanka a few years ago. Now, the UN did put out a resolution 30/1 in 2020, which asked Sri Lanka to essentially investigate itself for war crimes and take steps towards reconciliation. But these are all domestic investigations, so no referral to an international body. And this is fairly useless. It's the Sri Lankan government itself that's perpetrating these war crimes. And Sri Lanka has a very long history of bypassing and ducking and now flat out rejecting all UNHCR resolutions because they've never been held liable for anything in the past. 2021, UNHCR imposed another resolution, 40/1, which requires Sri Lanka to again investigate war crime allegations domestically, but this time with the Human Rights Council sort of enhancing its monitoring, with the Office of the High Commissioner for the Human Rights overseeing this prior to the next session, and Sri Lanka's response to pipe up with, this is a breach of our sort of sovereignty. Where am I? So my question is, I mean, this is what's the reason for UNHCR's inactivity with Tamils in Rajapaksa, Sri Lanka, but for also Kurdistan, yeah, Palestine, Western Sahara, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, to name a few. So it's these double standards that are intolerable. So I was going to end with sort of Michael Moore's acceptance speech. Can we go back to the Zoom? But I don't think we've got time. So I'm going to present my first speaker. There we go. Are we able to zoom in on Thoreau? Yep. I don't know. That's fine. Thoreau, can you unmute? I'm just going to introduce you. It's just going to waste time. Can we get rid of that? Okay, so this is Dr. Thoreau Redcrow, who's pretty much our own Michael Moore. He is an American global conflict analyst who specializes in geopolitics, stateless nations, and armed guerrilla movements. He's a frequent speaker before the United Nations Human Rights Council and has been a foreign policy advisor for several semi-state entities. He has previously worked on the ground throughout the Middle East, Latin America, and Eastern Africa, whilst also living amongst Kurdish guerrillas throughout Kurdistan. He holds a PhD in conflict analysis and resolution with specializations in ethnic conflict and terrorism. And what an absolute privilege to have you here. So the floor is yours.
Okay. It's an honor to be here and speak about these topics. Obviously, she touched on a lot of different issues in her opening presentation that I'm able to, add to and speak on myself. The first thing I guess that I would mention is the fact that what the conflict in Ukraine especially has shown to the world is it's shown that there's sort of this hierarchy of human lives that exists. You've seen a lot of commentators speak about the fact that the disproportionate amount of media attention that tragedies get, in Ukraine get vis-a-vis other conflicts happening almost simultaneously at the exact same time. Along this past, 6 weeks or so, you've had certain days where there's even been, bombings of Yemen taking place at the exact same time as bombings in Kyiv, and only the Kyiv bombing receives almost any international attention on CNN, BBC, the various Western outlets, but also even non-Western outlets. And so what you start to see is that there seems to be this hierarchy of lives. Now, it doesn't mean that it's wrong to cover the conflict in Ukraine or the tragedies in Ukraine. It only means that all conflicts should be covered as the one is being covered in Ukraine. So, for instance, I think it's very heartwarming and great to see the international attention that Ukraine's received. An international award shows, the flags, the songs, the lighting up the Eiffel Tower, all of these things. But what it exacerbates is this fact that almost non-European or non-Western groups don't traditionally receive this kind of attention, especially when their tragedies happen, and a lot of times much larger tragedies with much larger death totals. And so, the kind of classic cliche in international relations is usually one death in the United States or in Europe is equal to, perhaps 50 deaths in the Middle East and maybe 1,000 deaths in Africa, that to sort of to make them proportional as far as attention and sort of concern in the world press. As somebody who's dealt a lot with the United Nations Human Rights Council and the United Nations itself, I can tell you that this hierarchy exists as well in the realm of international relations. And this is why our international system is not set up to solve problems, especially when the 5 states on the United Nations Security Council, the United States, Russia, China, France, and the UK, these states, because of the way that our system is set up, because they have veto power at the United Nations, they pretty much have carte blanche ability to carry out almost any policy that they want throughout the world, and they can't be stopped. This is why the United Nations is totally inept to stop Russia and their invasion of Ukraine, because Russia has veto power. Now, they can do cosmetic things like removing them from the Human Rights Council and these kind of smaller issues, but all that shows is that sort of only brings more light to the fact of how inept our larger international arena is to punish this kind of behavior. And I think it's also no coincidence that the 5 nations in the world with the most nuclear weapons are the 5 nations with veto power in the Security Council. And what it shows is that the nuclear weapons themselves act as sort of a trump card for accountability. The reason why the United States can't fight Russia directly and why they never will be able to fight Russia directly is because you would have mutually assured destruction of the entire world, enough nuclear weapons to destroy all life on Earth 10 times over. And so because of that, you have this sort of proxy system that's set up. And this kind of proxy wars between going all the way back to the Soviet Union and the United States have taken place from the 1950s on through today. A lot of the coups and CIA inspired overthrows of democratically elected leaders that were shown in the clip that she showed throughout the 50s, Arbenz and Mossadegh and all of these. This is all part of that proxy kind of system that we have in the world. And because the United States and Russia can never fight directly, what they do is they fight each other through, through proxy style. So you have a situation like in Syria where, Russia deploys the Wagner group, and then the US deploys what used to be called Blackwater or Z mercenaries, and they sort of fight it out there. And then they each pick a side. Russia picks Iranian-backed militias. The United States has largely backed the Kurdish groups in Syria. And then you sort of have these, proxy battles taking place. You also see it in the United Nations, you have this problem that takes place too, where the sort of what you could call the larger hypocrisy that takes place. This sort of do as I say, not as I actually do. So for instance, Russia has committed, a litany of war crimes in the last 6 weeks. However, it's 100% factual to say that they haven't committed any offenses that the United States themselves haven't committed hundreds of times over the last 10 or 20 years. If you put up any side-by-side view of Mosul after the U.S. bombed that, or Raqqa during those campaigns, and then you put up the cities that Russia is now shelling with artillery, they almost look identical. And so the sort of cynicism that you get in international relations is the fact that we hold certain countries to a standard that we don't hold other countries to, when all of them should be held to the same standard. As far as stateless groups, she mentioned the idea of, Kurds, Palestine, Western Sahara, you have other groups. The other problem with our international system is because it's state-based, we don't, if you're not within this sort of exclusive club of nations, you don't get the representation at the United Nations. And most of these countries have forgotten what they were before they were admitted. So for instance, there's a lot of things on the books at the Human Rights Council that say all people have the right to self-determination, that they all have the right to fight alien occupation, racist regimes, and all of these things were written in the 1960s when there was maybe 60 nations in the world instead of 190, and a lot of these countries still were fighting the colonial occupier that was occupying their lands. And as these countries freed themselves throughout Africa and the global South and the Middle East, and they achieved independence, what they basically did is they sort of pulled the ladder up from under them, and then now they're denying that same right to other stateless groups now, like Tamils and Kurds and Sawahiris and Baloch in Pakistan, and you even have groups within Europe, the Basque and the Catalans and other groups that are saying, well, we're using your own documents that you wrote that says all people have the right to self-determination and the right to take up arms, and now when we try to do it, you're labeling us terrorists and you're putting us on terrorist lists when all of you were also on terrorist lists. So for instance, Nelson Mandela and the ANC was on the terrorist group all throughout the 1980s and 90s. I always tell people the most useless list in the entire world are the international terrorist lists, because they're basically just a list of groups that, for geopolitical reasoning and bargaining and positioning, a state will list a certain group, and then they'll take them off, and then they'll put them back on, and then they'll take them off when they can send them weapons to use them to attack a nation that they don't like. The U.S. is notorious for this, but other nations do as well. And you have the classic adage that one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter, but it's really even beyond that. It comes down to this idea that and you see this in Ukraine, which has been very, very interesting for me to watch. It seems that only certain groups of people from certain areas who look a certain way, who belong to certain ethnicities, have the right to resist oppression or resist occupation. So if you think back to like a month ago, all through CNN and BBC, there are all these wonderful stories about people making Molotov cocktails in Kyiv and throwing them at Russian tanks. And there were stories about young children even taking up arms. And if these same young children were in Yemen or in Africa or something, it would be, child soldiers. And it would be, the frontline news about how terrible it is. But because when it's a 12-year-old blonde Ukrainian girl, it's like, oh, how heroic, she's fighting for her village. She's saving her city. This idea of, isn't it amazing that people can build roadside bombs to blow up Russian tanks? I mean, these are this same behavior when it was in the Middle East and everything. It was seen as terrorism by the United States. These people are planting bombs and blowing up vehicles. And this sort of inability to look at it from the perspective of the other side. In talks, I always like to use the analogy to people of describe a hunt. There's an African proverb that the hunt always looks different to the lion versus the hunter. And I like to ask people, like, how would a hunter describe a hunt versus a lion? So, a lion, if they were describing a hunt, they would say, well, I was sitting there minding my own business under a tree, all my own. And then some guy started wandering out of the grass with a gun and shot at me for no reason, and he wanted to mount me and cut my head off and put it on a wall, and he was a barbarian or whatever. Now, how would the hunter describe the hunt? Well, I was bravely walking through the savannah, and I discovered this man-eating monster lion that I had to shoot because I was, I mean, as an analogy, sort of from how things can look from the perspective of where you are, Ukraine has really exacerbated this issue where we've seen all of a sudden militancy, revolution, fighting the occupier. If you literally just change one word of it, this could be Palestine. This could be, so many number of conflicts, which throughout the world we've, the West has decried this kind of violence, has said, oh, well, you need to wear a sandwich board instead. Why aren't people just handing out flowers? Well, but when it's Russia invading, it's like, oh, well, people have the right to do whatever they want. If you have to use explosives or militias or child soldiers or, so that's one of the greater hypocrisies that I see. But also, a lot of my, I mean, there's so many things I would love to touch on, but I know we have a short amount of time. But one of the things that I would leave people with as well is that I've been embedded, and I've had the chance to live with many different armed guerrilla groups and armed militias and fighter groups. And the thing that I would point out from my interviews with a lot of them extensively is the people that become armed guerrillas or armed resistance fighters. If these occupations didn't exist, this would be your professors, your doctors, your politicians, your artists, your musicians. This would sort of be the best of society. We like to look at them as sort of the most militant and the most destructive, but oftentimes, especially amongst my work with armed guerrillas, I mean, these people they're disproportionately usually have a college education, come from a good home. We're very literary as children, read lots of books. They usually have a high appreciation for art, for classical music, for things. I've interviewed armed guerrillas on the kind of novels that they read, the kind of art that they enjoy, and kind of what put them on the road to taking up armed rebellion. And what you see is these would be the sort of best that society has to offer. But when you place any group of people in a situation where they're armed and occupied and oppressed, and their sisters are raped, and their mothers are murdered, and their villages are burned, and they're denied their human rights, what you will get is armed militancy, you'll get violence, you'll get people who all of a sudden are perfectly fine making the compromise that violence is acceptable, and in fact, it's the only solution, because if you're gonna die, you might as well die standing rather than die on your knees. And so I wish that the situation in Ukraine could be sort of an eye-opener for people throughout the West, especially because since we do have this hierarchy of nations, you sort of have what I call the Anglo center, and this is sort of the United States, Australia, the UK, and then the EU, and then you have the sort of outer periphery, which is pretty much most of the rest of the world, who are held to a different standard and are sort of.
Sorry,
yep.
I'm so sorry to cut you off. We are very time limited. I'm going to have
Okay.
to move on to the next speaker. Thank you so much.
All right, I'll stop there.
Just so we can have some time for Q&A with you also. So our next speaker is Angela Fredericks. Angela joins us from Biloela in central Queensland, where she works in private practice as an accredited mental health social worker. She spent 10 years working in both the government and non-government sector before entering a private practice where she specialises in trauma therapy. Over the past 4 years, Angela has spearheaded and pretty much been the heart and soul of the Home to Biloela campaign. This is a grassroots movement to return our Tamil asylum seeker family to their home in Biloela after they were forcibly removed by the government. This has become a high-profile case from Sri Lanka to Europe, but the family remain in community detention now, but in detention for the last 4 years since the girls were toddlers. Angela and the entire community of Biloela, Queensland have tirelessly campaigned for this family, and without them, they'd have lost all hope. All right, the floor's yours.
Great, thanks so much, Melanthe. So thanks for having us here to talk today. And what I really want to focus on today is let's bring people back to what our policy is actually doing. So what the Biloela family has done for the vast majority of Australians and even internationally is actually allowed us the opportunity to put people on the face of policy and to actually look at what are we doing as a nation, what are we doing as a society, and how is our language being used to oppress people who at the end of the day are our most vulnerable. So I'll I'll go back to the beginning. I'm not sure what everyone knows of the story. However, Priya and Nadez travelled to Australia separately. They both went through so much persecution during the Tamil genocide. Priya herself lost a fiance who was burnt alive in front of her in her village. Her family fled. Nadez was conscripted into the Tamil Tigers. He managed to escape, and both of them separately made the decision to take the perilous journey by boat to get to Australia. So let's start there with our very first set of persecution that our Australian government has taken on these people. So Australia, as a signatory to the Human Rights Convention, the Refugee Convention, has said that if somebody gets to Australia, they have the right to apply for asylum. Australia made the decision to say that if you arrive by boat, it was illegal. So right from the get-go, we are basically talking about a group of people who have no documentation, who have no neighbouring countries that are signatories of the convention, and so who are forced to basically make a decision: do we stay and face death, or do we actually hop on a leaky boat? And I think our government has done a great job of making this seem like a huge crime, when if you sit with people who have made that journey, you know, the stories you hear, I know I've sat with Priya and heard the stories. We are talking people who have decided that they are better off going on a boat, being exposed to rape, being exposed to drowning. These are people that can't swim, to get here. And then what does Australia do? We persecute them for making that trip, all in the name of saving lives. So Priya and Nadez both arrived in Australia 2012, 2013, and essentially they assumed that when they arrived here they would be safe. And yeah, it was far from the case. So they both spent time in detention before being released. For Priya, that was a whole year that she spent in detention before being released. They met, they got married, they ended up in Billawilla. And that's essentially where we start to see the next step of how difficult it is for these people to get asylum in Australia. So for Priya, she arrived in 2013. She could not apply for asylum until 2016. So Priya was part of what's called the fast track visa process. So this is essentially a process that the government brought in for a very small group of people who arrive by boat during particular years. And essentially what the fast track system did, it actually meant that they no longer listened to individuals' asylum claims. Instead, they purely looked at the country information, the DFAT reports that are held by the government, and that's what the decision is based on. So for Priya, so essentially her submission was put in and they basically looked, okay, country information for Sri Lanka. Currently, our DFAT report states that Sri Lanka is a safe and peaceful country, even to this day with the riots that are going on at the moment. So essentially, it was an automatic not in need of asylum. And that's how simple that decision is made. Now, the other issue that happens for these asylum seekers is they are encouraged to go rurally. So our town of Billawilla here, we're a town of 5,000 people. We have over the years had numerous asylum seekers settle in our communities, and we love it. We love having asylum seekers come to our town. We get workers, we get community members, we get children in our schools. However, essentially, and I do know Albury is on that borderline for regional, but essentially what we all know is in rural Australia, we don't have great services, whether that's health services, legal services, the works basically. So essentially, by moving these asylum seekers rurally, what we are essentially doing is cutting off their access. So for Nadez and Priya, what this essentially meant is they did not have lawyers complete their forms. So Priya, she had a beautiful woman, but a very untrained woman who worked for Anglicare organisation, who actually completed her protection application. Now, I'm not sure if people in the room have seen what a protection application looks like. They're in depth, you know, they require a lot of detail. The lawyers will be able to attest to, you know, the sort of information that needs to go in those. We had an untrained woman complete that application for Priya, and then that is essentially what her whole claim is based on. So that's another way that the Australian government actually makes it harder for these group of people. Let's fast forward. So basically in 2018, early hours of the morning, 50 Border Force police turned up on the doorstep of Priya and Nadez and removed them. Now, I'm sure people have seen the snippets of interviews that Priya has given where she explains, you know, they were removed in their 90s. They weren't allowed to change. The girls, so at that time, a 2-year-old and a 9-month-old, weren't allowed to be with their parents for the entire day. So they were put into separate vehicles. When they were put on planes, they were kept separate. Little Tarnika, 9-month-old, she was still breastfeeding. So she went a whole day without any of that support from her mum. When they got to Melbourne, so they were taken to Melbourne to the detention facility there, and that's when we started seeing the next lot of torture that our government puts on people. So in that detention facility, the girls, they were allowed an hour and a half of outside time a day. So during that time, both girls developed vitamin deficiencies, iron deficiencies, the works. What this meant for little Tarnika as a 9-month-old is in her development of simple things like her teeth. Basically, they grow through rotten. To this day, she now has no front teeth, and it is going to have a lifelong impact. So I'm mindful of time, so I'm trying to just get everything in. What we have seen, and I guess this is my plea for all of you as health professionals. So during this whole story, and there's so much online you can read about it. However, what this whole thing has taught me is what is our duty as health practitioners. So here in Billawilla, so one of the very first leaders of this whole campaign, Bronwyn Dendell, she had her job threatened. She worked for Queensland Health at the time. She was explicitly told she could not advocate for this family. I guess all of us know that feeling of we have clients on our books, we have patients on our books, and it's when does our duty end? So for lots of people, that ends at the end of the consult. They pay their fees, they go, you know, and that's the end of where we're allowed to do any further. I guess what this case has shown me, though, is just how pivotal health professionals' opinions are. So when they were in Melbourne Detention Centre, it took doctors to fight for these girls to start getting fruit and vegetables. It took doctors to advocate for these girls to be allowed to attend playgroups. It took doctors to actually force the government when it came to they were sent to Christmas Island. It was doctors who fought to get this family into community detention. It was, again, doctors who fought to keep them in Perth so that they could get the health treatments they needed. So I guess what this all comes back to is, end of the day, I do think I'm near the end of my time. Is that right, Melanie?
Yeah.
So I'm just going to put that plea out to all of you. Never underestimate your power. Our government needs to be held to account. We are committing humanity crimes in our own country. So as doctors, as, you know, I know we've got lots of health professionals here, please use your voice, whether that's talking to your MPs, writing letters, use your voice, because at the end of the day, I believe this is why we all became health professionals, so that we could help humankind. So let's use our voices. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much. Okay, lastly, we have Maha Ramakrishna. As usual, she's underplayed her bio. Maha is a Tamil human rights lawyer based in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. Maha has worked actively with Tamil refugee community in Malaysia since 2018. Her clients are essentially the world's most vulnerable population with the least financial remuneration, the asylum seeker and the refugee community, LGTE, widows, wives, mothers of the enforced disappeared, men on death row. She's been a frequent speaker at the United Nations Human Rights Council and fought actively against the Tamil genocide machine since 2012 and organised anti-government protests from 2012 to 2018. And this is dangerous. So the floor's yours.
Thank you, everyone, for this opportunity. I would like to speak a bit about the Tamil genocide, the background to it. Okay, firstly, the north and east of Sri Lanka is a continuous Tamil nation since time immemorial, and ancient Tamils practiced the religion called Saivism, like Tamils in Tamil Nadu. Currently, Saivism is called Hinduism. Later on, Tamil Buddhists from Tamil Nadu and Buddhists from other parts of India migrated to Sri Lanka island. After the arrival of Buddhists, sorry. After the arrival of Buddhists over time from India, there was created the Sinhalese language and race in the island. There was no Sinhalese race in India. A few wars were fought between the Tamils, Saivite and Sinhalese Buddhist kingdoms. When the Dutch, Portuguese and British colonized the island, Christian missionaries converted some Tamils and Sinhalese to Christianity. Muslims from India settled mainly in the east and became Tamil speaking. In the whole island, Tamil speaking people were Hindus, Christians and Muslim, whereas Sinhalese were majority Buddhists and a small minority Christians. For ease of administration, the British made the separate Tamil and Sinhalese nation a single entity in 1833, and its administration office in Colombo, which is in the Sinhalese nation. Even before independence of Ceylon, the British allowed Sinhalese elites to colonize the Tamil nation in the east in 1930s by settling Sinhalese for farming there under guise of irrigation of non-arable lands. The British did not want Tamils and Sinhalese unity or Sinhalese and Muslim unity, and they encouraged division between the races under their divide and rule policy. They allowed Sinhalese to mass attack Muslims in 1915 and kill them. The British also played a role in having a Buddhist book called Mahavamsa be translated from the rarely known ancient language of Pali into English, and later it was translated to the Sinhalese language. Quoting this book, the Sinhalese were taught by Buddhist monks that the whole island belonged to Buddhists. They are the chosen people to live in the island. And the prophecy is that one day the whole island will be inhabited by only Buddhists. It is this ideology that is used by the Sri Lanka Sinhala Buddhist state to commit genocide of Tamils, done in the name of Buddha, but strangely translated to include all Sinhalese by glorifying Sinhala chauvinistic supremacist behavior. When Sri Lanka got independence in 1948 and became a dominion, the settling of Sinhalese in the Tamil nation became an important national project, including settling of Sinhalese convicts in the east to intimidate the Tamils and Muslims into allowing such settlement land grabs. For 30 years, Tamils resisted peacefully Sri Lanka's successive governments' various genocidal policies. This despite Tamils being attacked violently in protests, their Tamil cultural gatherings and pogroms. Tamils were inspired by Gandhi and Hinduism's non-violent teachings. However, in 1977, the Tamil leaders and Tamils in the north and east agreed through the ballot box that there was no way to protect themselves except through the creation of an independent Tamil nation. To achieve this end, receiving no mercy but violence from the Sri Lanka state through Tamil's non-violent struggle, the Tamil armed struggle began and fought the Sri Lanka state for 35 years. LTT kept major land grabs in the Tamil nation to an abeyance. After LTT was defeated and the physical genocide of Tamil civilians in 2009, Sri Lanka state intensified private land grabs and land colonization in the Tamil nation, giving reasons of national security, forestry, fisheries, farming, tourism, development, and others. It was done to permanently change the demography of the Tamil nation. Sri Lanka also allowed foreign nations like China to grab land strategic to its interests in the Tamil nation for the economic activities, while also giving US access to other parts of Tamil nation for US military logistical purpose. All this amounts to non-physical genocide of the Tamil nation. Other ways include Tamil women and children feeling unsafe under the heavy military presence, as there are reported incidents of brutal rape accompanied by murder of children, of women and children by the Sri Lanka military. Households with no men are unnecessarily visited by military personnel. Tamil men live in fear being suspected of sympathizing or supporting LTTE, as this can lead to torture and forced disappearance and indefinite detention with delayed or without trial under Prevention of Terrorism Act. Livelihood of Tamils are also badly affected by the highly intimidating involvement of military in businesses, farming, tourism, and others, depriving Tamils of thriving businesses and jobs to make Tamils become slave-like and dependent on the kindness and meager, low-paying work opportunities provided by the colonizers. All this leads to Tamils, very young up to elderly in the Tamil nation, to live in trauma, fear, and anxiety from genocide. The permanent solution to this conflict and its ensuing genocide is a free Tamil nation. However, the international community, meaning mainly US and UK, and also China is not international community, but they are the other side. Okay, but anyway, they have not been supportive for the creation of a free Tamil nation due to their geopolitical interests. US sees Trincomalee in Tamil nation as a strategic military logistic location for their military. Rajapaksas and the opposition allowed US military logistical exercises in the island. Rajapaksas and the opposition also allowed China to have its points of interest for its Belt Road initiative established in Sri Lanka. Due to Sri Lanka's balancing act between the two superpowers, we see the effect in votes in UNHCR with regards to resolutions against Sri Lanka. Countries indebted to China vote as per China's instruction. Same with countries under US control. Sri Lanka, now as a near bankrupt state due to corruption, need financial help of these superpowers to either sink or swim in its foreign debt. In return, more parts of the Tamil nation and Sri Lanka will be given control to the superpowers, to the superpower like China, or US will be given more US military access as in the past. The financial crisis in Sri Lanka is unprecedented. There's a loud cry in Sri Lanka for regime change. A regime change from the Rajapaksas does not stop the non-physical genocide the Tamil nation faces. Currently, Tamils, at the very least, will be glad to see the war criminals go, as they cause the current economic and inflation problem. But what really Tamil have been crying for the past 13 years, as far as the war criminals are concerned, is for them to face justice for the physical genocide and enforced disappearance of 150,000 Tamils in 2009. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We've got 2 to 5 minutes for questions. Did you want to?
Yeah, I was going to ask Doro something.
Yeah, did you want to come here?
Thank you, all of you. Sorry, Rosie Saxon, I'm a GP and a counsellor. Thora, you mentioned about the fact that Ukraine's getting so much media coverage and that all wars should be like that and all of these conflicts. I'm really interested that the fact that we're seeing so many of these images now, I think there's a real risk that people develop compassion fatigue And then there's just kind of, oh yes, it's another sort of conflict. And seeing, you know, horrific pictures like that of people, you know, the mass graves and things like that, and also the fact that the media is so responsible for a lot of this stuff, which of course we know the media's being controlled and all of that stuff. So what's your suggestion on how these things could be better managed, or the media could highlight what's happening?
I believe that the question was for me, right? The first part of it was cut off on my end, so I think so. But yeah, I think compassion fatigue is a real risk, as you've spoken about. You know, I mean, a lot of people that have done tests have shown that, you know, the average person is likely to maybe donate to one cause, you know, every 2 years or so. So because of the fact that Ukraine sort of is eating up so much of the world's attention right now, you may have an entire globe that will look at it like, oh, well, I did my part for Ukraine. So in 3 months, when there's some gigantic famine in Ethiopia or some problem in another country, they might say, well, you know, I can only focus on one thing at once, or I've done my part, you know, sort of this idea. So that is a genuine risk that people could, you know, reach compassion fatigue. I think one of the other problems, especially with the way that the media covers these tragedies, is we do a great job of humanizing you know, Ukraine from like a on the ground standpoint. They'll send people there to interview the mothers of a child who was killed or whatever, and we'll tell you about their whole life, and we'll run like a 20-minute, you know, human interest story segment, which is great for building empathy. Now, unfortunately, our media is not usually doing it for empathy building. They're doing it for geostrategic reasons, to make you hate the one who did this to this victim. So it's like, it's more of a sort of a Orwellian kind of, let's all look at how terrible and evil Putin is, or Russia is, and look what they did to this nice family. When there's a conflict where Australia or the US isn't necessarily doesn't have a side that they need to root for, they don't do that human interest aspect, because there is no good guy versus bad guy. You know, the West likes conflicts where you can have a very clear line between, you know, the dragon and the dragon slayer, and we like this sort of cliche kind of good versus evil. When there's conflicts where, you know, let's just take as Maha spoke about, you know, in Tamil Sri Lankan conflict, the West doesn't really know, well, who's the good guy there, who's the bad guy. They're kind of confused. They don't know who, you know, do we run a sad story about a Tamil family, or do we run a story about a, you know, Sinhalese family? You know, they're not really sure about what side to land on. So yeah, that's another genuine risk as well, that sort of desensitization. I didn't know if Angela or Maha wanted to speak on that issue too.
Yeah, I think I'll just mention from our perspective as well, we've been so careful in our campaign, from lots of the readings we've read, not to focus on actually what the family went through in Sri Lanka. So particularly for, you know, for Western people who haven't known that sort of trauma, we find people do switch off. And that's definitely that compassion fatigue as well. You know, so focusing, just like Teresa was saying, focusing on the human interest story and where do we have connection with these people, what's the same, that's where you keep people engaged. So it's been an interesting learning.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Question. I want to just panel. This will be the last question. I'm just trying to create a historical aspect of this. My family name was Tassika, and they came from the Isle of Skye. And after the clearances of 1745, they were all removed from the island. Now, this was real genocide, not just sort of getting into some people. This was real genocide. And so the people lived in poverty in Paisley in Scotland for a number of years, and they migrated to Australia in 1825 and lived in Wedderburn. So we actually wrote to John Major saying we wouldn't mind our land back. It's in the Isle of Skye. But he said, unlike Wick and Mabo, we hadn't occupied the land forever, so we couldn't have it back. So I think that, you know, this sort of thing is repetitive in history. And I don't know, what's your solution to that?
That doesn't make it right.
Doesn't make it right, but that's what happened. We had to make a new start in this country, and we were seen as immigrants. We're all immigrants here.
Would any of the panel Adrian Kay, one of the principals, would any of the panel like to address that question? And that'll be the last that we'll be able to, last question we'll be able to take. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fair, correcting historical injustices is always a fair point that the ICC's dealt with, the United Nations dealt with, all countries have to deal with this. We have the same issue in the United States as far as like reparations for slavery. You have hundreds of years of historical wrong. How do you hold
Also
a current state?
Indians too.
Yeah. I mean, how do you hold a current state responsible for maybe historical injustices that took place hundreds of years prior? I'm sure even in Australia with the Aboriginal population, the same kind of issue on. I think my best sort of solution or to how to look for that is we should look at the ways that the current state or structure or people are benefiting from the behavior that took place, sort of the historical wrong. So if you can show a direct connection to, okay, the state did this, and because of that, now you have a disproportionate amount of people suffering these kind of things. Because what my research has shown is that you develop what some Native researchers have actually called a soul wound, that a population can sort of from generation to generation, historical oppression can be passed down, and it's passed down in their ability to metabolize stress. And we for instance, they've looked at like even children born the mile vicinity of where they were born in hospitals to the 9/11 attacks on that day. They've even seen that the stress that the mothers experienced that day has then been passed on to the born children from that time. So we know that what we kind of are now calling epigenetic markers exist within populations. So when you imagine if you have a group that's been oppressed for hundreds of years, they are going to have all kinds of health issues related to that, all kinds of current things that they start out with, that disadvantages them. And a lot of times what our society calls success or non-success is related to these kind of unseen soul wounds that we're unaware of. But I'll let the others speak on that as well.
So I think we're going to have to wrap up because everyone starts at 9 o'clock. I'm so grateful for all of you for joining us today, and it's been enormous. It means so much to me. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanne. That was great. I heard you were nervous this morning when Jen asked you how you were going.
Oh
That
God,
was
yeah.
Terrific.
Thank you,
presentation. Thank you very much.
No, thank you
Yeah.
for letting me.
Thank you for bearing your soul wound.
Yeah, unfortunately, we all do. Thank you very much, guys, all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Good luck, Angela.
Good luck.
Yeah, bless you.
All of you, actually.
I'll send you a copy of the recording.
Great.
All right,
Thank you
thank
very
you.
much.
Okay. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Let us know if there's anything we can do, Angela.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
definitely.
Keep up the pressure.
That was great.
Thank you.
David handshake.
I figured out how to make it bigger.
Oh.
Are we right to end it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. See you later.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.